as I just said, it is necessary to pass the props to the super. If you don't do that, we usually, if you don't do that, you are gonna end up having a lot of bugs because you don't have access to props. So the important part that I want to show you here is just this console logs. Okay, console.info. I want to categorize different types of logs just to show you how they actually work. For instance, in constructor, in mounting methods, I have used console.info. So here, lifecycle method constructor number 1. This is the first step, as I showed you before. The second step is after constructor is called, we will have component will mount, which means component hasn't been mounted yet. So this is the console log that we have here. The third step, if you remember, was the render function here. Mounting, number 3, lifecycle method render. The fourth step, after render, what we had was component did mount. And if you remember, we had only 4 steps during the mounting process. Now let's just load the components. Okay, before we do that, let's just see how I have used this component. Workshop pages. This has been exported as the default component, and inside index.js you could see that here I have imported this workshops page, and inside that I have an index component. Right here I have used workshops page, and as you can see, I passed 2 different properties. One is title, which doesn't change, but episode is bound to the state of the index component, which means if episode changes inside the state, the value, this render function is going to be called, and then the value of episode has changed, and the property of episodes, which has been passed to workshops page component, has changed. So we will cover that later. At this moment, we want just to see how this workshops page is being mounted using React. So let me open my page again. Console, clear everything here. We are going to, okay, let's just come back to the components. It was info mounting. We had used console.info. Let's click on info to filter, just to to show only console.info that we have had in our code. And let's reload the page. Awesome. As you can see here, we have lifecycle method constructor as our first step. The second step, component will mount. The third is component render, and the fourth one is component did mount. So before we continue, I want to show you something. As I said that before, Next.js has server-side rendering out of the box. We don't have to set up something to have server-side rendering, which means if I do view page source, I am going to have all this data, as you can see here, and the React components of the page here. Yeah, React data, React ID. This is the attribute that React uses when it renders a component. So the important part here is to understand the difference between server-side rendering and client-side rendering. When server-side rendering happens, component React, what React does is interesting. What it does is just first is to initialize your component. Second is to call your constructor, and then call component will mount and render your function. which means after render we are going to have this string, HTML string of the page, and then nothing, because component is being mounted inside your browser, not in your server. So we have two different renders. Let's just open that and go to all, and let's clear that and reload the page. Beside this warning, as you see this connected here in my console, what does this mean? It means that the client-side rendering, React in client, has been connected to what server has sent as the rendered output of the current route. So, for instance, server renders the component, sends the string to the server, but because server cannot mount the component after the component is loaded inside your browser, it is being mounted. So let me just click on this again and reload the page. Just to make sure, I'm going to show you this. As you see, let me just clear everything and run the whole application again to have a cleaner console log, because we had a lot of building page. Awesome. Okay, I guess now we are good to go. Let me reload the page. Awesome. Okay, let's go through this. As you can see, first, lifecycle method constructor, component will mount, and then render, number 3, in mounting. You see here? Why we have this updating number 4? Because I didn't have any choice. I had to put these two console logs, one for mounting process. I could just comment that out just to make sure we have a proper and reload the page. Okay, now we have just these 3: constructor, component will mount, render. Let's just compare these two console logs. This one that we have in this terminal shows us, the process of, server-side rendering, calling the constructor, component will mount, and render. But on the right side of the screen, what we have is the whole process completed. Constructor, component will mount, render, and component did mount. If you want to make sure your component has been mounted, you can put some flag in your component did mount function. Although you don't have to do that, and you don't need to actually have that, but if you want to, you could also do that. Okay, as you see, we have 4 steps in client, 3 steps in server. Okay, this was one of the important parts of this session that I wanted to explain. Okay, let's go to the code again. Let's just take another look. Now what I want to show you is the updating process. The component that we are talking about is workshops page, as we all know. And the only property that it has is episodes. And I guess it's not the only property. Yes, it has 2 different properties, title and episode. But if we don't pass anything to the title, it has a default value. And here, if we don't pass anything as an episode, it doesn't have the default value. And that's why initially inside here, no episode has been shaped yet. Let's see what it does in the constructor. It reads the episodes from props. If you pass the list of episode to the props, it is going to render that inside your page. Let's just try that here. Inside this episode, it reads this index component, reads that episode from its state like this. And instead of passing the episode from a state which is initially empty, let's try this. Let's just pass the mock episode that I have imported from here and put it right here. If I save this and reload the page, as you see, episodes, a step-by-step walkthrough of Redux data flow, and the second one, for instance. Okay, now we have the list. Okay, let me push it back, undo my changes. Okay, so the important part here is this episode is empty initially, but I have here something called load episodes, a function and a button. Load mock episode number 2, because we inside workshops page we also have another button. I want to show you different types of updating process, because a component cannot change the property from inside. So this load episode, what it does, it can only load. Let me just go to the load episode right here. It can only load the mock episode and pass it to the state, but it cannot change the props, which means the component is not being updated through using passing properties. It is being updated internally. If you remember, we have two different ways of updating a component. One component can only change the state. It cannot change the properties, the props. The props is being set from outside of a component. So let's just one more time review what we have here. Default props, episode is empty. In constructor, I read episode from props. Is there anyone here who cannot understand this syntax? Because it might be confusing sometimes if you don't know what this syntax, how this syntax works. Let me get back to here. Okay, we have one question. Before I cover that question, I want to ask another question. We all know how this destruction assignment works. This is, this syntax is something like this. Const episodes equals props dot episodes, or for instance something like this. These two lines of code are exactly the same, this one and this one, but as you can see, this one is much cleaner. That's why I use this syntax. Okay, let's get back to the question. Okay, it is an interesting question that we are going to cover in this session. What use cases are there for component will mount? What can you do that is useful when the component has yet to be mounted? I haven't seen this used much. Yes, you are correct. You're 100%. It's 100% true. The point is, it's not used that much, but there are some cases that we need it. For instance, one of those cases that I wanted to show you, let me just inside my notes, for every single use case, every single step, I usually have some workshops here, number 3. Okay, component will mount. It is invoked before mounting. It hasn't been mounted. It is called before render. Therefore, setting a state in this method will not trigger a re-rendering. So the point, one of the important point here is, if you change the state, it is not going to re-render the component, because the component has not been mounted yet. So the point is, if you want to change, in some cases we need to change the state before, based on some specific criteria, before component is mounted. That's why we use this. Or for instance, one of the cases that I had used, I had created a component. I had created a framework based on React, and in my component, I needed to know if my component is mounted or not, but not using the is mounted flag of React itself. What I did, I added a flag to my component will mount, and I set it to true. And in components, we have different phases. One is the process of mounting. The other is process at the end is unmounting. And when a component is being unmounted, I had set that flag to false. There are different types of use cases, but all of them revolve around this specific point. When you need to change the state without re-rendering, you could only do that inside your component will mount, or you have to, if you want to, you could change the state and prevent the re-rendering in component should component update. So does this make any sense, Daniel? Awesome. Let's get back to code. Okay, we covered the mounting process. Now let's cover the updating process. As I showed you before, what we have here, we have a workshops page component and a property called episode. One more time. As you see here, episode is a property which is being passed by the parent component of workshops page. Why? Because workshops page cannot decide about the episodes itself. So now here is the important part. When we click on load mark episode number 2, what it does, it calls this function. It calls set state, and it just create a clone from mark episodes, passes it to episodes in a state. And now after this set state, as we know, because state has changed, the updating process is going to be started. The first step, let's go to the note again. The first step of updating process, where are we? Right here, is component will receive props if there is any type of properties. The second one, based on the properties that is being passed, has not yet been passed completely. Okay, based on the properties, you can decide whether you want to prevent the re-rendering from happening or not. Here in this function, and component will update and render, and component did update. We have 5 steps. Okay, let's open here, take a look at all of those steps. The first one here, updating, component will receive props, updating, number 1. Number 2, should component update, right here. Number 3, component will update. Number 4 is the render. That's why I want to comment this and uncomment this. Okay, and component did update, number 5. Save this. As you see, this is using console.log, not console.info. Now let's go back to the page and clear. If you remember, when we called on load mark episodes, we had new episodes here. Now if I call that, not is going to happen. So let's just clear the log and click on this. Updating step 1, lifecycle method component will receive props. Next props is this. Updating number 2, the updating phase, method number 2 is should component update, because I have that return false in my code, this is not going to continue. This is going to stop. The updating process has been stopped right here. So if I return true, it means it is going to render that always. So that's it. The updating process is not. So that's why we need this. In some cases, we want to do something. We want to prevent the rendering process. Okay, this was the code. So now I guess if you change the property, this is how it works. We have 5 steps. But if you don't change the property, what if the component itself changes the state? What happens then? Okay, let's just go inside the component. Inside this component, I have added this button right here, load mock episodes 1. What it does, as I showed you before, it loads the episodes and passes that to the state called setState and passes the mock episode to that. So what happens here is okay, as you see, because we here, because it is mock episodes, it is not right here. The only step that is being called is step number 2. Why? Because we haven't passed any properties, because component itself is changing itself. That's why the component will receive props is not being called. So we could have one conclusion here. Whenever we have component will receive props, it means something. The parent component has passed new properties to its child component. When during the updating process, component will receive props is not being called, it means that component itself is changing itself, like the way that we do it right here. So load episode, pass the that. So let's just why it is only one step, because here in components should component update, what I do this, I compare if it equals to mock episode, I don't want to re-render. Let's just do something. Inside this load episode, let's just again clone this object. Clone, I'm using Lodash. Clone this object. Okay, just to make sure, yes, we do have Lodash. Okay, now if I do this and reload the page, and now if I click on this, this is going to work. And the updating is not, as you see, is not interrupted anywhere, because it checks if this object is exactly the same object. You see mock episodes here. I have this. Let's change this. Clone mock episode instead of number 2. Yeah, instead of on this clone, I could just pass this. As you can see, it works, which means the updating here, right here, the update should component update is not preventing the updating process from happening. Why? Because it only cares about mock it only cares if episode is exactly the same as this object mock episode. So now we have as you see again, we only have 2, 3, 4, 5, which means we don't have 1 because the change is happening internally. Okay, we have covered mounting process, we have a covered updating process. The unmounting phase is not that big of a deal because it has only one single method, and if the question is when it is going to happen, the question is really easy, the answer is really easy. All we have to do is just to click on, for instance, this about, what it does, it goes to another page, and this page is going to unmount every single component of inside that page. Let's just clear everything. Click on about. Okay, we are here, and inside this info I have unmounting lifecycle method component will mount. That's it. As you see, if you change the route, if you move from one page to another page, the component is going to be the component inside that page is going to be unmounted. Okay, we have covered all of those three phases. Now I am going to, just based on what we just said, to wrap up this session, I am going to now read the the explanations. Okay, mounting. Constructor is called before it is mounted. We have props, we have states. Props, when implementing the constructor for a React component subclass, you should call super props. I said that before. Any other before any other statement. Otherwise, this props will be undefined in the constructor, which can lead to bugs. State is the right place to initialize the state, as we have done it right here. This is the only place that state is not read-only, because it's not the actual state. It is the default state that you define right here. It is the initial state that you define. In any other point inside your component, you should use set state other than your constructor. Okay. Component will mount is invoked immediately before mounting. It is called before render. Therefore, setting a state in this method will not trigger a rendering. So this is really important. We talked about pure functions in previous session. So when we say avoid introducing any side effects or subscriptions in this method, which means we have to, if we want to write a component, will mount, that component should be pure. We cannot do DOM manipulation. We cannot, because if we do, it is very likely that we are going to end up having a memory leak of some kind or other kind of issues. Render, okay, render just as we all know returns a single React element, should be pure again. Render function, inside render function we should not do DOM manipulation, we should not use set timeout, we should not use any type of operation which could cause any type of side effects. The component, the function should be pure. And if you need to interact with your browser, this is the point. You should not do that inside your render function. Perform your work inside component did mount. This is exactly the point. When we are in server and we render the component did mount is not being called. Then when we don't have window, when we don't have the DOM, we cannot do anything. But if there is a missing attribute in your component, or if there is something that you cannot add to the component, let's say you are using a third-party component, you could use component did mount number 4, which is invoked immediately after a component is mounted, to do that, to perform some kind of DOM manipulation, add some kind of attribute. Initialization that requires DOM nodes should go here. Anything that you do, if you want to, for instance, use jQuery to do something, you should put that right inside component did mount. If you need to load the data from a remote endpoint, you should put it right here. Of course, if the API call, for instance, that you are having, you don't want that to be part of your server-side rendering, you should put it right here. But if you want to have the data initially before the component is loaded, you should call your API before the component is loaded. That's why it says if you have a remote endpoint to call remote endpoint point for your API, this is the right point to do that. Setting state in this method will trigger a re-rendering. Why? Because component has been mounted. Now if you change the state, again it is going to be it is going to update the components. As we just cover, updating component will receive props. We know everything about it because I just showed you. Is invoked before a mounted component receives new props, not change inside the state, just props. If you need to update the state in response to prop changes, for example, to reset your state based on a property change, you may compare this props and next props and perform a state transition using this set state exactly the way that I have done it right here. Component will receive props, and I do this next prop, I read the episode from next props, and I do set state. Because I want to store the episodes passing to props inside the state. So should component update? I guess I don't have to read it because I just showed you how it works. If a component's output is not affected by the current change in state or props, you could use this component to make sure of that. The default behavior is to re-render on every state change. And in the vast majority of cases, you should rely on the default behavior unless you have a specific use case that you want to prevent the re-rendering from happening. Component will update will not be invoked if should component update. I showed you that also. When we return false, component will update has not been executed. Okay, is invoked immediately before rendering when new props or state are being received. Use this as an opportunity to perform preparation before an update occurs. So the point is, there are some cases that we need to prepare for change. This is the right place to do so. Again, render number 4, and at the end component did update. It is immediately invoked after updating occurred. This method is not called for the initial render. What does it mean? This method is not called for the initial render. If you remember, I said that when your component is being initialized, when your component is being mounted, none of these methods are being executed except for render, because component has not yet been mounted, so it's not possible to be you cannot call that update unless the component has already been mounted. So, and at the end we have unmounting, which is invoked immediately before a component is unmounted and destroyed. So the important use case that we have here is we could perform any necessary cleanup in this method, such as invalidating timers, canceling network requests, or cleaning up any dump elements that were created in component did mount. One of the interesting use cases in cleaning is canceling network requests. For instance, let's say your user is inside your component and keeps clicking on the load data button. You send the request to your server, to your API, but before receiving the response, your user changes the route, clicks on another, in your layout, clicks on another part of the menu and goes to another page. Then, during that process, you should cancel the network request that you have sent. If you don't do that, you are going to have something that is some part of your view is alive, whereas your component is dead, which is not a good thing. We used to call this, using Backbone, we used to call this zombie views, because they are actually dead, but they exist inside your browser's memory. Okay, so you can have access to all of this codes inside the repository, and I hope you have enjoyed this session as well. So there are other parts of this code that you could also read, but I tried to make this as precise as possible and as valuable as possible. And let's see if you